name is Ashley, and I work in business development over here at Prevalent, and we're joined with some very special guests. Samira Duijnmayer, compliance manager at Booking.com. Hi, Samira.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here.
Bob Wilkinson, CEO of Cyber Marathon Solutions. How's it going, Bob?
It's going great.
And last but certainly not least, our very own VP of Product Marketing, Scott Lang.
Hey, Ashley.
Just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending out the recording along with the presentation slides shortly after the webinar. You're all currently muted, but we love participation, so please put any questions in our Q&A box, and we'll be able to go over them at the end of the webinar. Today, Samira, Bob, and Scott will be discussing their perspectives on TPRM, so I'll go ahead and hand the reins over to you guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Ashley. Hey, everybody. Welcome. As Ashley said, I hope everybody had a great U.S. Thanksgiving if you're based here in the States and have kind of come off of your turkey malaise, or the tryptophan malaise, as they call it, and ready to kind of jump back into the work world here. As Ashley said, we've got two very special guests with us today, and the format of today's webinar is going to be an open Q&A style format where we're going to pose a few questions and have some different perspectives shared on those particular topics in third-party risk. I think this will be a lively and engaging webinar, something that will keep your attention and might be worth taking some notes. As Ashley mentioned, we will send this presentation out to you in the recording of this webinar out to you tomorrow, so that you'll have access to it and can kind of listen to it again, read through it, and get some additional insights to help grow and manage your TPRM program. So with that, I'm actually going to have Samira and Bob do very brief introductions of themselves, just to lay the groundwork for today's discussion and provide a reason why you should pay attention to these really smart people. Samira, you go first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Samira Duijnmayer. I'm based in Amsterdam, so you can see it's quite dark outside already. I work for an online travel agency, Booking.com, for about 5.5 years now, heading the program for third-party risk management and financial crime compliance. And prior to working for an online travel agency, I used to work at several law firms where I advised big corporates on compliance policies, best practices, on how to best manage third-party risk. And at Booking.com, I built the third-party risk management program from the ground up, which is actually very amazing because you have a lot of flexibility into the design. I'm currently leading a growing team. For the people less familiar with Booking.com, we have grown from a small Dutch startup to one of the largest e-commerce companies in the world. And we basically invest in digital technology to take the friction out of travel. So we started with accommodations only, but have now expanded into all areas of travel planning, basically enabling our customers to do more without having to go to multiple platform service providers. So customers also have the option to also book ground transportation, car rentals, attractions, flights directly on our program. Glad to be here and looking forward to an insightful panel.
Awesome. Well, welcome, Samira. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Scott. My name is Bob Wilkinson. After spending more time than I care to remember in financial services, where I played the CISO role, operational risk head, and various other things. For the last 8 years, I've been an independent consultant working in op risk information security, and a lot of the time focusing on third-party risk management. I've been involved in the space pretty much since it began, and looking forward to the conversation today with Samira and Scott.
Awesome. That's terrific. Welcome, Bob, and welcome both of you. And thanks so much for the opportunity to have this conversation. I think with our attendees, be very educational. So as I mentioned before, the format of today's call, we're just going to kind of jump into some questions. And, these are topics that come up fairly often in conversations with third-party risk professionals and practitioners. We're going to distill those things down and give kind of Samira and Bob's kind of perspectives on these particular topics. As we get through today's presentation, I do want to remind you, if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A window in the Zoom app here. We'll triage those and ask those to Samira and Bob as we get through our presentation today. All right, so first question of the day. Let's start out with a big one here. Regulatory. So there's no shortage of regulation in the industry, especially in third-party risk. And this last year, regulators have been very active with new cybersecurity reporting requirements from the SEC, U.S. financial interagency guidance, several new AI regulations, and then obviously, multiple ESG type regulations that are emerging out of Europe. I guess my question, Bob, I'll start with you. What do you say what do you consider some of the biggest challenges? Oops, I think I skipped ahead of that one, didn't I? What does that third-party risk landscape look like in the next 12 to 24 months for you? I mean, what areas should we as practitioners be worried about, and how do we kind of prioritize some of those landscape changes over the next year or two?
Well, Scott, I think it comes down to execution. I think that the regulators have been very clear that what they're interested in is execution. And are you doing what you say you're doing? So as you mentioned, there's been a lot of new regulations from different agencies, and it's not just banking and financial. You always have to be aware in healthcare. There are regulations in other industries, but from a financial services perspective, which covers a large space, really the regulatory focus is do what you say you're going to do and be able to demonstrate you're doing it. The interagency guidance, the update that occurred there, that was the interesting phrase, was interagency, because there had been slight differences between OCC, Federal Reserve, and FDIC in their guidance that they were offering. The main thrust of their regulations were to standardize. So let's all get on the same page, and primarily to incorporate the OCC 2020 FAQs, which were additional guidance that the OCC provided at that time. So the key thing that regulators are interested in, which is at times at odds with what banks are doing and other financial services companies, is regulators don't want to see compliance. They want to see risk management. And too often what happens is financial services are focused on compliance. Well, compliance doesn't necessarily equal effective management of risk. So that's really, I think, the key trend that you're going to see. I don't know how much more regulation in the U.S., perhaps around environmental impacts on financial services companies is certainly an area that's going to come out. From a European perspective, you're going to see the continued focus on environmental and social legislation, following on from the German supply chain due diligence, which was effective January this year.
Oh, I think we lost Bob.
Yeah, I think you do.
Yep. Hey, Bob. Hey, Bob, we can't hear you if you can hear us. All right, well, we'll pause Bob. Samira, may I pitch it over to you? Give me your perspective on kind of what you're seeing in the EU. Are there any types of compliance regs or risks that regulators are really kind of zeroing in on?
Yeah, I think Bob actually made a nice bridge right now. I hear myself echoing. Hello?
Yeah, we hear you.
I hear myself echoing. Try again. Yeah, there's an echo. Yeah, it's on my side as well.
Maybe try a different phone. Can we hear you, Samira? Can we hear you, Samira?
Test, 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 test. Still an echo. I think everyone has an echo.
Bob, how about you? Can we hear you? Okay.
Samira, try again.
Hello, hello.
Okay,
hello.
we hear you.
I think. Oh, no. No. Hello, hello, hello.
I only hear you once.
Okay.
Samira, I did Bob, and I think that
it could be. Yeah, I think. Yeah, all good.
Excellent.
So let me continue on the EU regulation. I think Bob already introduced it, but indeed, on the EU side, we definitely see some movements around the directive of the corporate sustainability due diligence. And, basically this legislation requires in-scope companies to conduct due diligence and take responsibility for human rights abuses and environmental harm through their global value chains. And what this basically means in practice, because, it's all about execution, and what does this actually mean for companies is, think about, driving new risk mitigation strategies for sustainability, meaning that TPRM programs or companies could be required to develop and implement measures to address sustainability risk in their supply chains, which in practice means, okay, companies might be required to conduct. I hear myself echoing again.
I fixed it.
Yeah. All good?
Yes, good.
So companies are required to perform, extended due diligence requirements. I hear myself echoing again. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it sounds like every time Bob comes off of mute, we can hear you twice. So, so Bob, just keep yourself muted if you're not directly speaking.
I think Bob just left, but I'm happy to continue.
Yeah, good.
So, think about including for purposes of extended due diligence requirements, think about including sustainability questions to, for instance, your due diligence questionnaires, or perform an audit on, so you can actually evaluate their adherence to, recognized standards, but also including those in your contractual obligations and supplier code of conduct. So, this definitely sets expectations and requirements for sustainability practices, with, consequences for non-compliance, for example, includes those, relating to fair labor practices, waste reduction, emission controls, all into your supplier code of conduct and contractual obligations. So that's really on the practical side. But then also what I'm seeing as well, and that's not necessarily only EU, but really globally, is, more and more sanctions are imposed due to the fact that there's a lot of turmoil in the world right now, right? I mean, look at the war in Ukraine, or now Israel-Hamas wars, which basically means whenever there's a conflict, more sanctions are imposed on individuals, entities, and potentially regions, which in practice means, as an organization, you have to ensure that your supply chain and their supply chains, third-party suppliers, are not subject to the growing list of sanctions regimes. So I think, what is most important is, depending on the industry and the type of vendors companies work with, new and existing regulations are either, applicable or not applicable. And it might well be, that you would, as a company, look at more regulations around cybersecurity or sustainability, depending on the type of vendors you work with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excuse me. I think, I was going to ask you the question. I think you might have answered it, but I was going to ask you the question, if there's a sort of a balance between cyber and non-cyber when it comes to regulatory enforcement. Like, has the pendulum swung a little bit from a laser focus on third-party cybersecurity controls to maybe something a little bit more along the line of supply chain controls, or, reputational controls, or, financial controls, things like that, right? Do you think there's a balance that we're slowly getting to from an industry perspective, where these things are maybe going to kind of even out a little bit?
I think it really depends on the type of organization you are, the type of vendors you work with, and the types of regulations you need to adhere to. But what is more, what is let's say you work in an organization where 80% of your inventory is are software or technology companies, but 20% is more around let's say firms who perform lobbyist activities. We can never say, 80% of our inventory are focused on software, which means we need to prioritize cyber-related risk management activities over the remaining 20%, because it really depends on the type of regulator and also how they measure the potential risk. So it's always difficult. There's no good answer, right? It's always difficult to measure.
Yeah. It's kind of a good segue to the next question. And Samira, this would be a good one for you as well. One of the things you have to demonstrate to auditors is that you have a TPRM program in place on some level, that you have some control over your supplier and vendor base. You're doing regular reporting and whatnot. When you're building your program, you're building the Booking.com program, for example, or other programs in the past, what were your challenges and how did you address them? In building some sort of a sustainable startup type program here, what were the biggest challenges? How did you conquer those challenges?
Yes, indeed, building a sustainable TPRM program involves addressing various challenges, right? And to ensure its effectiveness over longer term. But I think, one of the first things that's coming to mind is the complexity and scale. I think, managing third-party relationships can be complex, especially for organizations with a large number of suppliers or, a diverse supply chain. So either you don't know what level of risk assessment or due diligence you want to apply to them, or you don't even know where the third parties sit in your organization, and maybe even have 5 onboarding channels. It doesn't really sit within a centralized function. So you don't really know where these third parties sit. So you have to think about a systematic approach by categorizing suppliers based on risk levels, prioritize due diligence efforts on high risk vendors, but also, for instance, use technology and automation to streamline processes and handle large data sets efficiently. I think a lot of companies also struggle with resources constraints, limited resources, including personnel and technology can definitely disrupt the effectiveness of TPRM. So it's always good to leverage technology if you have that. But what I'm seeing a lot and have seen in the past is striking the balance between mitigating risk and achieving business objectives. Most businesses are out there to make money, but don't forget, not complying with TPRM will cost you money. So it's important that you align your TPRM goals with overall business objectives, conduct risk assessment that consider both risk and benefits, and ensure that risk management measures do not unnecessarily hinder business operations. So really think about, customers first, and try to balance this with managing risk as much as you can.
Yeah, that's a great foundational point there, that opposing force of business impact versus compliance, or business impact versus sustainability, or business impact versus, good processes going forward to measure risk. That's a great kind of balance point to kind of strike. Bob, have you seen the same thing as you're kind of building up your TPRM programs on your side? Does that jive with some of the same challenges that you faced? You're on mute right now. Still on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Sorry.
I can hear you now. There you go.
Okay, yeah, I had a little technical difficulty there. But yes, everything Samira said is absolutely appropriate, particularly the balance between business goals and risk mitigation. Some of the things that I would add to that foundation that she mentioned, it's important to have the right level of management, engagement, and support. So how that risk of the use of third parties is communicated to management for me, is a critical aspect of things. You have to have engagement. You have to understand who your stakeholders are. And when I take a view of stakeholders, I take a very broad view. So, it's not just your immediate management. It's senior management, it's the business units, it's the board of directors, and a whole list of parties that you have to coordinate with. Most importantly, from my perspective, being the sourcing procurement organizations, and also leveraging the enterprise risk organization that is present. That being said, the other things that I would focus on is getting your inventory right from the beginning. And when I say inventory, I'm not a big fan of the term third party anymore. I much prefer the term supply chain, because if you don't know who your fourth and fifth parties are, a lot of the bad things that are happening in this space with threat actors and hacks and things like that are the result of third and fourth party compromise. And if you don't look down into that supply chain for those business processes that you have defined as critical, and that's a key thing, criticality, and then understanding that full supply chain, that's a really important thing that you have to do in this space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, I think that's another good segue to the next question. And Bob, I'll go to you on this one as well, is, it starts with some sort of a profiling, tiering exercise, categorizing, understanding who your suppliers are, and then kind of, putting them into buckets so you can triage as appropriate. But what is the role of risk profiling? Transitioning from that into risk management. How do you really do this?
Well, you have to understand what's important to your business, and it varies across different industries. So we have to be clear about that. Too often in these conversations, we focus on financial services and healthcare, and the reason for that is those are the most regulated industries. Those are also the industries that tend to have the best security practices because of regulation. Because without regulation, it's sometimes difficult to make the business case to allocate the resources. But when I think about criticality, it usually boils down to three things for me: sensitive information, access to my infrastructure, and is the third party managing any of my critical internal control functions? And I'll just point to Okta as an example of that and some of the things that have gone on there. But if you use those definitions for criticality, that helps narrow down the things you need to focus on. Another way to do that is to talk to your IT people, the people who are responsible for things like business continuity and disaster recovery, because they're going to know who the critical vendors are that need to be available in order to continue to deliver your business services.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I mean, Samira, does that jive with kind of your perspective as well on profiling? And how do you view that from your perspective? Oh, you're on mute still, by the way.
I'm on mute. I was just being careful to
Got it. Okay.
Stop echoing. Now, as a compliance professional, I would always argue you need to embed, compliance as a risk area to consider, but perhaps there are, other areas that are more relevant to your organization. But generally, you need to ensure that you manage risk around, security, privacy, compliance, but indeed, depending on the type of third parties you have and what tools you have available to embed more risk areas into your, scope of assessment. I think, whether your organization works with 10 or 1,000 or even 10,000 third parties, the problem will always be the same, right? You have always limited resources. So you need to think about ways of, okay, how do I deploy them most effectively? And, in general, I strongly believe that TPRM is primarily about making the smartest use of your company's limited resources, and different risk teams focused on different third parties and risks, which have the most impact to your organization, and which tactics will help your company to be more proactive in managing third-party risks. How can you optimize your TPRM program to make better decisions for your business? I think, these are key questions I think you need to ask as an organization, and really think, okay, what are the which vendors pose the most compliance, regulatory, and reputational risk to your company. And depending on that, you build a risk management program around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think what you and Bob both echoed was, I think at the end of the day, it's all about that concept of operational resilience or continuity. And, that is what you have to, as your own organization, have to ensure. But also when you work with third-party vendors and suppliers, you have to understand their processes for operational resilience and continuity, so you don't have some sort of a downstream impact on service delivery, product delivery, or uptime or something like that. And that drives a lot of that profiling decisioning, I think. Anyway, I think you guys are spot on there. So Bob, I'm going to kind of circle on this because you brought this up. How important is it to look beyond your third parties? If you think about it like a concentric circle, right? You've got, your organization here, and then your third parties, and your fourth parties, and then your extended supply chain, and all that stuff, and that goes out ad infinitum. How do you tackle that? How do you look at your supply chain or your vendor landscape?
Well, that's a fascinating question. First, when you think about your third parties, how do you know that you have your full third party inventory? How do you know that all of your business units are following a common practice for onboarding? One way to get at this problem is if you go back and you get your last 2 years of accounts payable data, you're going to see everybody that you paid. And that's going to be a really good starting point for understanding who your third parties are. But then from there, understanding your fourth and fifth parties, one thing that you can do is contractually ask all of your third parties to disclose any fourth and fifth parties that they use as part of the relationship. That is an essential step, along with including a clause in any change that they make to fourth parties who have access to your sensitive, that prior written notification is provided by the third party. That helps you get at understanding, as you said, Scott, as you expand those concentric circles out. But the important thing to remember in this space is that most hacks that happen of organizations start with third parties. And what people don't really well understand is the layers of that onion, that a lot of those attacks start with fourth and fifth parties. Because just like you're making all of these efforts in your third party program to get your third parties to properly protect themselves and your information and business relationship, the bad actors, the threat actors, know exactly what you're doing. So they're saying, okay, where are the weak points that I can attack? Well, the weak points quite often are those fourth and fifth parties. So if you have some definition of criticality, what's really important to you, then you can focus on those third, fourth, and fifth party relationships to really understand what the potential exposure is. And it goes back to Samira's earlier point that we have limited resources and we have to decide best how to allocate those resources to mitigate the greatest risk to our businesses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Samira, maybe I'll pass this one over to you too. From your perspective, I mean, have you had success in requiring your third parties to disclose their third parties so that you get a picture of your supply chain? And, I understand the contract drives behavior, but are there other carrots and sticks available to you that you can get that information?
So it's a big challenge, and what can help and what often helps is in your procurement or vendor management software, you can, as part of their profile, you can often ask a question whether they would like to disclose this information or whether they work with other subcontractors. And then they feel more comfortable responding to that when it's part of their risk or their profiling in the vendor management tool. So that could be one of the ways in order to get that information, but it's always challenging. And, I see a question on the screen on, what are the risks of ignoring that? And there are absolutely risks that comes with that from a regulatory compliance perspective. If there are any risks relating with that, then if you ignore your extended supply chain, that may result in non-compliance with certain regulations. That's just absolutely correct. And the customers, whether there's a breach or an attack, the customers go to you as an organization and not to your extended supply chain, and that's very critical.
Yeah, you have to have the answer. You still own the risk, even if you have outsourced relationship,
absolutely.
right?
Correct. But it remains to be a challenge for many organizations. But I do think that making it part of your contractual obligations, plus embedding it into your supplier code of conduct, is a very good starting point. Especially if you have a regulator who is watching you, you can you demonstrate that you take your program seriously. And I think, it's one of the CYA exercises that you're able to do.
Yeah. Good transition to the next question, which I think is very relevant to an extended ecosystem. And, maybe Bob, I'll start with you on this one. Fourth-party software providers, Bob, you mentioned it a few minutes ago, Samira, you mentioned it as well. We've seen a lot of, third and fourth-party software breaches that have happened in the last several years that are very high-profile names that, are household names. Most recently this year has been the MOVEit breach, and that has impacted thousands of organizations. I saw an article written earlier this week or last week on the number of the thousands of organizations that have been impacted by that MOVEit software breach. How do you manage that? What happens when that fourth-party software becomes a third-party problem?
Well, it certainly is, and I think it's probably one of the biggest problems that we've seen the last year or so. It goes back to SolarWinds, Log4j, and now MOVEit most recently as the big third-party software compromises, which have resulted in big impacts on organizations. And quite frankly, it's not a topic people have focused on very much. And this gets to the whole idea of taking a holistic view of how things work in your organization and who your stakeholders really are, and the value of being able to reach out, to your security operations people, to your cyber threat intelligence people, and particularly around this software topic, to interact with your software architecture teams to understand who the critical third-party software providers are, to make sure that you have a good inventory, and where possible to marry that third-party software inventory up to your third-party inventory. The first thing that happens with a security incident is everybody wants to know whether anybody at your company is using that third-party software. That's the first issue. The second issue is, are any of our third parties using that software as well? And particularly any third parties who have access to our data, access to our infrastructure, because that's the way that third party weakness can be exploited by a hacker to compromise your organization. So it's really, I think, in some senses, a reset and a wake-up call to people that you can't just look at your third-party vendors. If you don't know what your third-party software inventory is, where it's being used both in your company, and then having a process by which you can easily determine where that third-party software is being used by at least your critical third parties, you have a real problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Samira, I'll pitch it back over to you. Any additional thoughts from your perspective on that, experience you've had in that area?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's coming to mind is you can think about ways to kind of require your third-party vendors to provide transparent reporting on their use of software, for-party software, for instance. So you can regularly, assess or audit on that piece of risk management, or look into kind of the incident response planning that organizations have. Clearly look into, okay, what are the processes that these companies have? Who are the stakeholders involved in those processes? Clearly define roles and responsibilities. So it gives you also some comfort on what they do in case of a breach. And then again, embedded into their contractual clauses, where, if they don't manage this, for-party software, if they don't manage it effectively, then you can even say, okay, we'll terminate your contract or impose corrective actions in case you breach those clauses.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a difficult exercise just to get a basic inventory.
What I would say, Scott, is though Samira's point is exactly right about contractual obligations. And in that initial contract, there should be disclosure, not just of any fourth parties that are used, but any software other than that third parties that they use to provide the service. In other words, this whole concept of what they call SBOM, software bill of materials, a detailed disclosure of all of the various software components that are being used to deliver the service to your organization is one really good way to get at this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great point. Great point, guys. The next question here is around, and we'll start with you, Samira, is, I think, fairly timely, and that is kind of, what's the right formula for assessing vendors? Is it part assessment? Is it part monitoring? Is it both? What comes first? What comes second? What does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, from what I have been seeing over the past couple of years, third-party risk management and due diligence usually takes a back seat after a third party has been brought on board. But TPRM doesn't stop at onboarding, and this simply makes organizations unaware of future third-party risks, which, if left unmitigated, can lead to critical issues that could significantly affect the reputation of your organization. And it really doesn't matter if the liability is on the third-party side, because ultimately the company that engages the third party is held responsible by regulators and customers for not identifying and addressing the issue. So I would definitely say that an effective TPRM process follows a continuous life cycle for all relationships and incorporates different phases. So you must have controls in place to manage this risk throughout the third-party risk management life cycle. But that means you also need to think about implementing several elements, right? So what I would say is you do more frequent monitoring throughout the third-party relationship, but each individual risk pillar will probably perform their own risk steering of each vendor engagement. And that risk steer will then guide the appropriate level of the ongoing risk pillar oversight and controls reassessment frequency, right? So I guess, the most important success factor is to structure and formalize continuous monitoring activities based on the risk level. And then, third parties who are classified as high risk must be monitored more closely. But also think about an automated system that could allow companies to do this efficiently. You can think about leveraging external sources. So, you have all your internal screening assessments, onboarding, risk assessments, and that's all critical, but it's also important to take information from outside of the organization. So think about leveraging external data sources like credit ratings, sanctions lists, adverse media, or negative news checks. which can provide you a complete assessment of third-party risks that would account for politically exposed exposure risk, anti-bribery corruption risk, or enforcement actions. So really leverage that technology for real-time monitoring of key risk indicators. And with that, it's also, of course, very important that you establish clear communication channels to address emerging risks promptly, because it could be that tomorrow something about a third party you work with will be alerted. So you need to have a process in place in order to escalate these matters and address those. Yeah.
We did a study. We do an annual third-party risk management study every year. Prevalent does, and it's a agnostic study. It doesn't promote Prevalent or anything. It's just a straight study of kind of practices in the market. And one of the most interesting things that was communicated in last year's study was the prevalence of assessment and monitoring at various stages of the life cycle. And it was astounding, and it followed this curve. Like, everybody assesses at the time of sourcing and selection and onboarding. And then once that onboarding is done, man, the drop-off is pretty dramatic. And the evidence would dictate that the next time like a proper assessment is done is when there's an external trigger event of some sort, whether there's a disruption or a breach or something. And then everybody's like, we got to do this again. And then anytime periodically for any compliance purposes, I think the holy grail perspective, though, is to have a nice, clean, and even cadence of performing that activity over the life cycle. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think what organizations are also afraid of is the manual component. And that's why I think it's very important that you find ways to leverage technology in order to, remove that burden of the manual component here. But I'm very curious how, what is Bob seeing in his organization relating to this topic?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you start continuously monitoring from the day you decide you want to talk to a vendor right until the day you terminate your vendor relationship. So initially doing that deep dive, as Samira mentioned, many organizations have different pillars that do assessments before you can effectively onboard. That's both a blessing and a curse, because one of the single biggest problems I see with
I think we lost Bob again. Bob, you must be broadcasting from Antarctica with no internet. Hello? I hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, I don't know what happened there, Scott. That was a weird one. Anyway, what I was saying is, you monitor from day one. You monitor through the life cycle, and you really, really need to ensure that you, particularly for those critical relationships, that you monitor on an ongoing basis across all of the risk disciplines. So it's not just security, it's not just business continuity, it's finances, it's your operations practices, it's compliance, it's ESG. You need to have a holistic view, and it needs to be an on view, and you continuously if you're going to effectively manage risk. The other thing that goes with that is initial onboarding with all the different pillars that look at risk. That slows down the whole onboarding process. One way to help get a jump on that is right when you decide you're going to work with a vendor, start your continuous monitoring there. See what with the tools and processes you're using, what you can learn about that vendor before you even establish the relationship, because that might give you very good insight and also suggest several things you need to address contractually before you move forward.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Keeping our conversation moving here, I'm going to pull the pin on this one. The million-dollar question of the day, where does third-party risk management belong? I mentioned that study that we do on an annual basis and every spring, and the results said that invariably security will own most of the assessment process, but procurement owns the relationship. That's not real clear, and I can anticipate a little bit of little bit of headbutting inside the organization as to priorities and whatnot. I'll start with Samira. I mean, what's your perspective on that? Where does it belong? I mean, I think maybe we answered that question on the slide here, but I'd love to know your thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is always a very controversial topic, and I don't think there's one good answer to this. But what I do believe is that the placement of third-party risk management within an organization can vary, right? And the optimal location often depends on the organization structure, priorities, and a risk management framework. And it can definitely fall under different departments, right? Each bringing, I would say, its unique perspective and expertise. So, one of the baseline questions organizations can ask themselves is, who has visibility on TPRM? Whose name is on the contract? Is it a business risk? And I think, depending on where you place TPRM, there are pros and cons to it. You can think about, if you look at legal and compliance, for instance, you will have maybe more, the TPRM approach will be more focused on regulatory adherence, contractual obligations, and legal risk associated with third parties. But the downside of that is that it might not fully address operational or strategic risks and could, miss the broader context of risk management. So what you can do is, you place the TPRM under procurement, which then emphasizes the operational and strategic aspects of the third-party relationships. Considering also factors as, performance, reliability, and cost. But then in turn, you have the risk of underemphasizing, non-operational risk or, cybersecurity compliance, if not adequately integrated. But I would say, my advice would always be, from what I've seen working, is a shared ownership, so cross-functional. TPRM responsibilities are distributed across multiple functions and ensuring a holistic approach that considers various risk dimensions, right? So I think what is very critical is coordination and communication, and building effective governance around that. I think that's, whatever you decide as an organization, that's critical, clear roles and responsibilities, and build a good, effective governance around that.
Indeed. Yeah, Bob, you feel the same way?
I do feel the same way. I think it's important that whoever has, let's say, end-to-end view into vendor relationships is the most logical place to put it in the organization, and that's going to vary by organization. So it may be the procurement organization, it may be the CEO, it may be legal, it may be compliance, it may be security. But who really has the most holistic view and understanding of the totality of the relationship, wherever that lies, is the best place to put it. Increasingly, I see that occurring in the procurement and sourcing organizations, but they do have to take into consideration all of the factors that Samira mentioned. And that's why understanding your stakeholders and taking a broad view of who your stakeholders are. When I think about stakeholders for information security, I'm thinking about legal, I'm thinking about compliance, I'm thinking about privacy. And at the end of the day, who's responsible for the relationship? Well, the person who's responsible for it is the person whose name is on that contract. At the end of the day, they have the ultimate responsibility. And while they can outsource some of the functionality, they cannot outsource their accountability or responsibility for the relationship.
Yeah, great perspective. And, I love that concept of the cross-functional team, Samira, that you mentioned, as, and Bob, to kind of meld your approach to have a chairperson of that committee whose name's on the contract, right? Everybody has their hand on the plow that way and can direct the direction of the field.
There's only one person pushing that plow, though, and that's whose name is on the contract.
That's right. Just a couple more questions here as we're kind of getting near the top of the hour in our allotted time. Let's kind of play queen for a day or king for a day. And, if you were granted a blank slate to build a TPRM program from the ground up, you've got a blinking cursor a blank Word document, an empty spreadsheet. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, Samira. Okay, Bob. What are the 3 things that you would do right away? Samira, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I can start. Well, the first thing coming to my mind is, you need to, am I?
Yeah, go ahead, Samira. You're good.
Define your, vision and strategy from the very beginning when building your TPRM program. Think about, what is your North Star and work towards that. If your goal is to build an integrated and coordinated framework to manage risk effectively and prevent, or mitigate negative outcomes such as financial loss, reputational damage, legal action, make sure you embed those checkpoints. Are you actually doing that? Is what I'm doing actually needed? But, you're asking, you have a blank paper and, what are the 3 priorities coming to mind? I would always start with governance. And with governance, it's quite broad, right? But I'm thinking about, clear roles and responsibilities. Build your case to get buy-in from senior management. Because as I said, earlier, who's doing the work and where do you create the accountability? And the business is there to make money, to sign as many contracts as they can. So there needs to be some benefit there for the business. I think you need definitely some buy-in, but also think about working groups and committees in order to operationalize your program. I think that's very critical. What is your operating model? How do you define your TPRM capability? And how will it interact with your stakeholders? You can think about, do I want a centralized program or do I want a decentralized program or a hybrid program? So I think that's all critical to be defined first. And then also, secondly, define your scope and understand your vendor landscape. Because, we spoke about it a lot over the hour. Your vendor landscape is absolutely important to, in order to define, what are the risks to your organizations, that may arise from your third-party relationships. And that also, assist in kind of the resource allocation for your risk management efforts, because you cannot do it all. And then thirdly, I would say, think about what you already have. Can you leverage something? Is it, what's working, what's not working? Build a program around that. Maybe you can think about using existing tools or processes to ensure seamless integration within the organization. Sometimes it makes it easier for stakeholders to incorporate those, into their daily tasks, or it avoids siloed processes, and it basically enhances your collaboration, right, across the department. So that these are the 3 things that I would start with.
That's great. Bob, how does that align with your 3 priorities?
There's definitely overlap. Governance is an important factor that you need to take into consideration. You do need to understand what the scope of your program is. What are you going to look at? Where are you going to focus your efforts? In the beginning, you're going to have limited resources. It's important to think about technology and automation because of the volume of data you may be dealing with, and on an ongoing basis, manual processes are not going to cut it. So automation is an important aspect that you have to factor in. But if you're going to think about automation and tools, you have to ensure that you understand how they're going to fit into your existing operational process workflows. If you haven't thought that out, your tools, your software is going to become shelfware. It's not going to be effectively used. The other thing is, I would start doing management reporting right from the beginning of the program. And I would use a very simple framework to do that. A four-page report. Page 1, what I've done in the last reporting period. Next page, what I'm going to do. Third thing, roadblocks to my success. Management, this is what you need to do to help me, because it's that management engagement that's going to create motion and prevent you from getting what I call started but stuck. So you need that engagement. And then finally, what do you need to make your management aware of? If you do that reporting, then it's hard for people to run away. You might say, what can I report on in the beginning? What you report on is all zeros. Well, you know what? That sends a message. I'm not making any progress. And that's going to, and if management looks at that and does nothing, well, that's the time to start looking for another job, because you're never going to get the support you get done in this place.
Yeah.
So that holds everyone, including your management, accountable. And I think that's really important, because there's a lot of it going on.
Absolutely. It's the art of managing up. Right.
That's right. And this is a space where if you don't manage up well, you're going to have problems. You're not going to be able to achieve your goals. Plain and simple.
Yeah. I'd say one final question for the two of you. You know, what do you think are the biggest mistakes that orgs typically make in third-party risk? You know, what do they overlook, and how do they overcome that? I think this is a good question to draft off of the last one where we talked about kind of your 3 priorities. But this is kind of a different way to look at it. What are the 3 mistakes organizations make, and kind of how would you resolve that? You know, Bob, I'll start with you.
Compliance versus risk is always number one.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you're just doing your program to ensure you comply with some kind of guidance or regulations, you know, that's a waste of time. You know, too many times people say, I did my risk assessment, my work is done. The risk assessment is the prerequisite for the real work, which is the remediation of identified issues, because it's only by doing that that you actually reduce risk. The second thing that I would talk about is what I refer to as the unfettered growth in the number of third parties used by companies. Too many times companies don't take the time to say, well, do we already have a third party that provides that service? And in that process, the simplest way to decrease risk and reduce your budget is to do the number of vendors that you allow to have access to your information and to your networks. It's that simple. Because if you just allow new third parties to be added endlessly, then you're just making work for yourself, and you're not helping your business, and your risk profile has increased dramatically. Those are the kind of things that I focus on.
Yeah. Samira, does that line up with what your concerns are as well?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I see a lot of organizations struggling with, what level of risk assessment and due diligence they need to perform. Performing an extensive due diligence on a cleaning company. That's something that I've seen. That's just, not making the best use of your resources. But, maybe also, a little bit from a different perspective on some of the challenges I have seen is, companies often, and maybe this is across industries, there's a lack of kind of standardization, across industries. So for companies, it's quite difficult to benchmark their TPRM efforts and share best practices. So I think it's always good to, get into the room with, your peers and understand, okay, what are you doing? And, and kind of benchmark your processes. I think that's very critical and something that I would suggest everyone to look at, to make it more effective, because there's a lot, companies, can do better or do it, more effectively or more efficiently. Definitely, but fully agree with what Bob is saying. That's exactly what I've been seeing over the past years as well.
Awesome, gang. Hey, we're nearing the top of our time together today, but what I want to do is make sure we open it up for questions. So Ashley, I don't know whether you want to triage a few questions here and ask a few that we've got built up. Just while you're doing that, I am going to just put up a single slide and scan through a little bit here of how Prevalent can help. So just a real quick overview. What we do from a third-party risk management perspective is help you deliver the insights, the automation, and ultimately the ROI and the results that you need to demonstrate third-party success throughout, the third-party risk management lifecycle. And we do that through expertise, through the data that we have on our platform, through completed assessments and inputs, as well as the automations and workflows built in our platform. So Ashley, like I said, I'll just kind of pitch it back over to you. I know we're at the top of the hour. I don't know if there are any questions we can kind of sneak in here at the top of the hour.
Yeah, of course. I went ahead and launched our second poll while you were talking, Scott. We're just looking to see if you guys are interested in augmenting or establishing a TPRM program within the next few months. And please be honest, because we do follow up with you. But yes, let's go ahead and get through some of these questions. Someone asked, do you recommend using alerting or monitoring technology on your third parties?
I mean, I'm more than happy to answer that one, at least from a compliance perspective. Yes, but that also depends on type of monitoring or ongoing monitoring I think organization want to do, right? I mean, one of the basic or minimum requirements is you will always do your sanction screening of your third parties on an ongoing basis, and if they hit in the sanctions list, you get alerted of it, or ensuring that you don't pay out or contract with a sanctioned individual in a restricted jurisdiction, for instance. So these are, I think, the bare minimums that you need to include into your program. But you can always take a risk-based approach and say, hey, I'm working with third parties that are higher risk from a bribery corruption perspective. So I want to do a more enhanced screening on those third parties. I don't necessarily think that needs to go through an ongoing monitoring. I think you can decide to do a yearly or a biannually check and an extensive due diligence on these third parties, or screen them against politically exposed persons lists to mitigate those risks.
Thanks, Samira. And then Bob, one more question. How would you go about managing third-party vendors that are politically influenced?
I'm not sure I understand the context of politically influenced. I don't know if someone can elaborate on that. That's a strange phrase.
We'll give them time to elaborate in the chat and move on to a different question.
Sure.
Have you seen a good way to track and use SBOMs for risk analysis and follow-up?
I think that's something a lot of people are focused on right now. I myself haven't seen anybody do that particularly well yet, but it's an emerging area. It has to be dealt with. I think it's one of the biggest risks that we're not addressing well. So it's important to understand the software, the API interfaces, everything that people might be using, but I haven't necessarily seen a good way to do it. My first thought is you always focus on contracts. And if you can capture it in the contract, that's the best way to start.
Excellent. Thank you, Bob. Well, unfortunately, we're at the top of the hour. So thank you, Samira, Bob, Scott, and everyone for all of your questions. They gave us some great information to take in today, and I hope to see all of you again, either in your inbox or at a future Prevalent webinar.